Hello, I'm Brad.
And I'm Jason.
You are listening to
Dice in Mind.
We have reached an episode that probably should have come a lot earlier in our series, and that is talking and getting into depth on Pathfinder, both first and second edition. A friend of ours, Brian, who was a guest of Jason's on our bonus episode, gave us a little just a nudge because he is one of our most loyal listeners or listener, depending upon what we believe.
Where loyal
Yeah,
equals only.
yeah,
Right.
loyal equals only. Make sure that we don't forget talking about that link between RPGs and real life. So we're going to try to be cautious and not get too far away from it. But Pathfinder and its history and everything is so rich that this episode may or may not deviate from that just a little bit. But in future episodes, we're going to really be on focus for that, especially even as we talk about some of the other projects we're doing and some of the other products that we're going to talk about. We always want to make sure, and then I'm going to get into this, make sure that we focus on, we aren't doing, there are a lot of great podcasts and videos, YouTube, people are broadcasting on Twitch, whatever, about different types of RPGs and how they work and all that. We don't want to just be another one of those. We want to talk about the application of the game. But in the case of Pathfinder, I think, Jace, you and I agree, there's a lot that we can do to set up future discussions about it by just introducing it maybe to the listeners a little bit, but in the game, but more really introducing our thought process behind it before we get into those other areas and even those other games. Because Pathfinder is, let's be honest, a linchpin game in the RPG universe. They were beating out D&D for a long time.
Yeah, we really feel like we have to address this and we want to address this. I mean, when we both got back into role playing going on 4 years this fall, at least for me, uh I I got you and Brian to play a little bit of Star Wars with me, FFG Star Wars, but then you were just really insistent you wanted to give Pathfinder a go. And so that's what we did. And so we've been planning on talking about this. Like you said, it's kind of the gorilla in the room because it's a huge game, it's a huge world. I think it's fair to say we both have a lot of respect for the creative process and minds behind Pathfinder. And like you were just saying, Brad, this is we're back on our way to our core mission, if you will, for the podcast, which is exploring RPGs through the lens of real life. And so we're going to talk Pathfinder now. We're going to talk Fate next week because that's the last big one with which we're both pretty enamored. Even though we don't play it, there are things about the system we really love. And then we're doing a deep dive. We're doing a series on world building and world building as it ties in really for us to real life. And it's just going to get funky from there on out. Um, so Brian, if you're still listening, you know, thanks for the nudge, as Brad said, because the question you posed, which we're going to save, because that's going to come up in about 2 weeks as we jump into what Brad and I want to do around world building. That's going to come up. So I'd say, Brad, what about 2 episodes, and we're going to come full circle to the very first one, and then we're just going to really get into it. Of okay, um, RPGs, our passion for them, the creative side of it, the writing side of it, not just the playing side of it, how it sheds light on real life, vice versa, and some of the stuff we're doing with it.
Yeah, I think we've done, we've crossed the dozen episode milestone. For us, it was as much a learning experience as we hope it will be for listeners. If you're a current listener who waits every week, or if you're a listener that comes later and is binging to get up to current point, you're going to see the theme of this start to switch now over the next couple episodes, because we've done the primers on these games. I remember going into a game store that a friend, Scott, had recommended to me, and I can't remember what I went in there for, because what I came out of that store is thinking, why are all these books called Pathfinder there? I was out of gaming, other than any like online gaming. I had been for years. And so I saw all these Pathfinder books and I'm like, my goodness, what is Pathfinder? So came home and naturally, inquisitively, went online and saw what D&D and what Wizards had done. And we're not going to rehash the whole history here, because better people and more experienced people and more learned people have talked about it. Ultimately, Wizards acquired TSR and then allowed for an open game license, and in effect allowed other companies to license and develop and create material for Dungeons and Dragons. What ended up happening is one of the companies that did the development for, as part of the OGL, was Paizo. They were producing material as for the D&D universe. In effect, they were a partner of Wizards publishing content. Then these restrictions came in, and we saw D&D moving in the direction to 3.5 and to 4, and company saw. I have a series of books over here that were developed around the time of Pathfinder. They didn't quite make it, from a company called Green Ronin called 220. So they, in effect, were doing what Pathfinder was doing and using the open game license to build their own RPG. And sitting in front of me, I have the second edition book. But Paizo, I want to get to what we call the adventure path discussion here in a minute. But I want to pause, Jason, because I've been doing all the talking. This idea of a company taking a product and using the open game license that was perpetual and developing their own game out of it, and it overtaking its parent, I think is fascinating from a business sense, but that's not why we're here.
Yeah, and I think on that note, Brad, one of the things that we so appreciate, we just respect deeply about some of these companies, not most of the companies, let's face it. The publishers of many of our, well, many implies there are a lot of them, but the publishers of our favorite games tend to keep things very much in-house, unnecessarily expensive, et cetera, et cetera. But then you have, back in the day, Wizards going with this OGL, this open game license, allowing for true creativity amidst fandom, and that openness, maybe not for publication, but that openness for playing remains with D&D. I'm talking about this for a reason. The D&D developers blog not too long ago had a post responding to the question, what's considered canon? And the gist of the post was, it doesn't really matter as long as you're having fun. But here's what we think. So then you get to Paizo, who just as a company seem to have such receptivity to alternative ideas. Yeah, it's really neat.
Yeah, and again, I did my research at like places like a Geek and Sundry, which I imagine many of you have read in some form or another, or have listened to material from them, or from comicbook.com. I'm not a comic book collector, but there's a lot of good RPG info in there. This idea of the open game license being one of the biggest mistakes that Wizards ever made. Now, Paizo published Dragon magazine, and for D&D players, Dragon was, the magazine. I think it's still published through the D&D app, if I remember correctly. I don't know if there's a paper version of it anymore. Wizards allowed a competitor to, in effect, overtake it. And Paizo, when they saw the play tests of D&D 4 coming out and saw that D&D 4 was so different, that's really was the, there was many, probably multiple reasons, but that was a big reason why they went down their own path, air quote, own path, and created Pathfinder. Pathfinder interested me at a time when D&D 4 had come out, before D&D 5 was fully published, because D&D 4 had it was a very controversial release of the product. For a lot of folks that didn't want to see that type of change, they went to Pathfinder, which was in effect the 3.5 rule set, and then they took off with the 3.5 rule set. I didn't understand all the business of this, so when I started looking at Pathfinder, I picked up the core rulebook. It took me a good year and a half after I first saw it, maybe 2 years, believe it or not. Jason may laugh, but it did take me that long to pick up the core rulebook and start reading. What I saw was a game that was very crunchy, that appealed to the analytics and data part of my brain, or a part of me. And the more I read it, now I didn't have a lot of material at the time. Then I started looking at the business side. D&D provided us, and then I'll let, because Jason, you found this as fascinating as I did. D&D gave us all sorts of realms to play in. You could go to a game shop, and a designated dungeon master would run an adventure or an epic or whatever the case may be. Paizo came out in a brilliant business decision and came out with these adventure paths and these Pathfinder guilds, where they were in effect sponsoring game playing at game shops, and they were building a series or adventure path that all these different game shops could use. I actually have the Rise of the Rune Lords, the whole the encyclopedia, all of the Rise of the Rune Lords in one volume that came out after that adventure path was done. I believe that was the first one. So they created this. They overstepped. They stepped way over D&D. D&D came back with their own version of this down the road. But from a business perspective, it generated revenue because people were buying material to play. But two, it created a very, very deep relationship with its customers by having this canned and having this sponsored and having Paizo provide material for it. And I could go on and on. I thought this idea of an adventure path is fantastic.
Yeah, you literally took the words out of my mouth. I mean, 4 words, right? Rise of the Rune Lords. Almost no matter what you play, if you're a gamer, certainly if you play in any fantasy realm or world, you've almost undoubtedly heard about Rise of the Rune Lords. Now, I've never played it, but I still sometimes think, I wonder if it would be worth just picking up the AP and reading it. And that is really what I think what we both think separates Pathfinder from D&D and really all of the rest. I mean, wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, they built, obviously D&D had built the different universes, Forgotten Realms and so on. Pathfinder allows you to have that creativity. It's not like you can't, but Pathfinder allows you that creativity, but also gave you this vehicle that was an adventure, an epic, whatever you want to call it, but it allowed people to get into RPGing with a structured product.
And a structure that guarantees progression. I mean, you might have your posterior handed to you by a dragon or whatever, but then you just generate another character, you jump back into whatever level you were. But this notion, I mean, so the APs, the adventure paths, I remember when you introduced this to me, Brad, I was like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And then of course, as is both of our wants, I went through and I made a list of every adventure path that Paizo had written. This is still 1E. Okay. Every adventure, first edition, every adventure path they had written, or I should say they had published. And I I put this on a post-it. I don't know if I ever told you this. I put it on a post-it. I marked the ones that looked interesting to me. And I swear to God, I kept it in my car. I did this for like a year or two. I don't think I ever, okay, Brad's shaking his
I
head.
didn't know that. I didn't know that.
I left it in my console because if I was ever at a local gaming store, uh, which for a while I would stop every month or so, every couple months just to see. Uh, I would keep it with me, and I could bring it in because this was so new to me, and I'd look to see what was in their discount bin. And it's like, okay, if this looks interesting to me because I read the synopsis for each, then and I did that with one of them. I think I grabbed like an early Giant Slayer, right? Okay, so why? So who cares? So I think what really sets these adventure paths apart and what really sets Pathfinder apart more than its mechanics, more than, like you said, it's kind of uber crunchiness. Let's face it, more than the fact that clearly, and we're not talking about anyone listening because we know you'd never do this, but I think Brad and I both know at least one or two gamers who play Pathfinder, at least in part because it's a feather in their cap. It's an ego thing that, well, I play the crunchiest of games.
Yep.
And obviously they've never seen Warhammer, but still not the point. So with these adventure paths, though, I mean, in a sense, in my mind, you are being guided through a massive novel. I mean, talk about creativity, right? Talk about creativity. You're being guided from level 1 all the way to, I mean, what, like, where do they top out? Like 15, 16, sometimes 20. I mean,
Yeah.
all the way at the end. 6 books. I think it's always, isn't it? Always
Yep.
6 books in an adventure path. And you kind of read through them, and it's really good storytelling, which is one of the reasons you and I like RPGs, not just for the action, not just for the combat, which we love, especially if it involves torches, but for the storytelling, for the immersion, for feeling like you are truly in this different world. And like in real life, your choices have repercussions, not just 3 sessions down the line, but I mean, man, like 5 books down the line. I mean, that's pretty cool. And that's Pathfinder.
And Rise of the Rune Lords, which was the first one that I obviously knew of. I picked up the 6 adventure tome all in one and read through it, and none of the, I shouldn't say like terminology and things made it into the game that Jason and I play, but this idea, he kind of knows this and kind of doesn't. When we game, we have kind of a little lowbrow humor where we come up with a name for each session. I also track episodes within Epoch's, EPOCH, not Epic, Epochs, that I know based off of how Rise of the Rune Lords is structured. I kind of do the same thing because I know that based off of where we've approached and where we've reached in the game, I know now that I can move them to the next stage. It allowed me to develop this game and be able to course correct it. I think we talked in a couple episodes back that I had allowed the game to become a little too cerebral and a little less action oriented. So it allowed me to go and look at my map, or in effect my tome that I'd built, and make some corrections so that I can account for it. Not only that, what's interesting, Jason, you may know this, you may not. This idea of adventure paths had become so popular that they actually came out with their own board game, Pathfinder board game, for each of the adventure paths. So I only picked up one, and I've actually just sold it because I don't use it. But I had the Rise of the Rune Lords board game. You can play it as a single player, which was the whole reason I bought it to begin with, because this is before you and I started playing. But there are card decks for each phase, each book of the adventure pass. There are card decks for 6 different character classes, and it was in effect a card-based RPG. They had taken that adventure path and turned it into a board game. And you and I were just talking about this before we started recording. There are board games, and we'll get into this at some point in the future, board games that have a very RPG-esque feel or function. And this was one that did that. So Paizo kind of crossed over with their branding into that area. Going back to what you said about Crunchy, you're absolutely right. I think that's one of the reasons probably why I wanted us to try it first, was because in our own ways, Jason does a lot of research, so there's a lot of statistics and such along with the writing that he has to do. Me, I work in analytics and research, or not research, but I work in analytics, so I work with a lot of numbers and crunchiness. I thought it would tickle that bone in a recreational way. Come to find out that I didn't necessarily want that in my gaming yet. I wasn't quite ready for it, and that's how we moved to D&D, which we've enjoyed greatly. Someday we'll get back to Pathfinder. I didn't pick up this material for nothing. But this is the game where I think you were down visiting, and I had been talking about it. We went to a game store, and you picked up the book.
And I picked, that's exact. I remember it really vividly. I picked up, in fact, up until a couple of months ago, I was still getting their emails, and I finally canceled that because it's like I just don't need it anymore. Really nice shop. I did. I remember vividly. It's like, oh, that, and it was a good deal. You and I have been talking about it for, man, how long at that point? And actually, I think the better part of a year, to be honest.
Well, in Pathfinder, remember now, they came out with all their tomes in hardcover. And then they went back and came out with them all in smaller paperback.
And that's all I've done. Right.
Yeah, and you picked up the player's handbook for under $20 in
right.
paperback form. I think it was like $18.99 or
I think
wasn't it?
Actually, I picked up the GM. I picked up the game mastery guide first. Unless I'm
No, you actually when you and I were at the game.
Was it the player's handbook?
It was the player's handbook.
Okay. Yeah, I mean they're short volumes, and I mean literally physical height. Nothing is short in a volume of Pathfinder. No. Right. I mean it's tiny font. It's really in depth, but I thought, okay, this is a good price. This is a great store. I'm with friends. Let's do it. And I'm glad I did, because that allowed me to get into it. Now, ironically then, talking about all this crunchiness and how Pathfinder came to be kind of as a response, a rejection, if you will, to what many felt was a dumbing down of D&D as it slid into 4th edition. Now, already a while ago, we have Pathfinder 2nd edition, which ironically is in some ways a simplified version of 1E. Now, and I that makes it sound a little oversold. It's clearly not a dumbing down, but there are some definite economies in 2E compared to 1E, because let's face it, I mean, I'm just guessing here, but you look at what D&D 5E brought in, they've taken the world by storm.
Oh, they've D&D 5 came in and, like you said, took the world by storm. You're seeing online, you're seeing celebrities playing this.
It's cool to play.
Yeah, the pandemic, gaming exploded because you could Zoom game, much like Jason and I here are Zoom recording.
30 years too late for our childhoods.
Yes, pretty much. Yeah. Well, by you saying 30 years, I think you're being generous, but I'll go with it.
30 plus years too late for our childhoods.
Let's leave it at 30 plus. But if you think about it, Pathfinder 1E was a reaction to D&D 4, maintaining the status quo, and they brought with them a consumer and player base that didn't want to see 4. 5 came along. The way it was developed, the way it was released, Wizards kind of took a couple pages from the Paizo playbook, built up and I'm almost embarrassed. I forget what the adventure paths and the guild, what D&D does now, but they do the same thing where they have sponsored sponsored gaming groups at gaming stores.
What, Dragon's Guild?
Thank you. Something like that. Yeah. Well, all of a sudden now Pathfinder is starting to feel a little bit like the dinosaur
Mhm.
because they acquired all those 3-5 players that didn't want to go to 4. 5 is appealing, and it is simpler than going back to first and second edition like
Okay,
you
but
started.
as an analog to this, because I do
Mm-hmm.
think it's, and I honestly, everybody, I haven't really thought about this in this way before, but listening to you, Brad, as an analog, and again, this dates us a bit, but I'm okay with that. I mean, that's kind of the point. Everybody knows we're in our 40s, right? We've got professions, we've got families. That's what Dice and Mind is about. That's why it's about RPGs intersecting with real life by choice, right? We're not just geeking out. Yeah, we are just geeking out, but we're geeking out in a way that has both implicit and intentional meaning for us. So let's back up to the 80s, especially the mid to late 80s. We saw the same thing fiercely between Apple and IBM, Apple and Microsoft, especially. Apple's operating system and Windows were and are both better, astronomically better, because they were chasing each other. And I think we're starting to see that slowly between, and with way, way more overhead between Paizo and D&D.
Well, we go down a rabbit hole, but I'll leave it at this. Much like Wizards had the open game license that allowed Paizo to build Pathfinder, Apple, in its infinite wisdom in the 80s, minus Steve Jobs and such, decided to license or allow and not litigate in a way that was winnable
The
Microsoft
episode
for
of John
Windows.
Scully.
Yeah, yeah, and Gil Amelio and Michael, I can't remember his Spindler, Michael
Yes,
Spindler.
yes,
And
well
all that.
done.
I'm an Apple nerd. Another podcast, another day. We're both Apple nerds. Pathfinder felt like they had to play a little catch up, I think,
Yeah.
because of the way D&D exploded. People were able to jump into this game. You were seeing it on Twitch. You could see both games on Twitch, but if you watch a Pathfinder game, it is, in my opinion, I'm going to tell you what my opinion is. It is a calmer, more interesting, cerebral view than when I watch D&D games played. And think about it. You have Critical Role, you have Acquisitions Incorporated, you have all these different groups. Acquisitions Incorporated is kind of D&D comedy in some ways, but there's a real seriousness to it.
I love I love the book, but the 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 actual plays are just, they're pretty
It's
asinine.
Yeah, it's goofy. I mean, I
Yeah.
played Neverwinter Online, which is
Oh yeah.
a D&D online game, and
Right.
they added in a whole, I don't know what you call it. I don't want to use adventure path, but a fork in the road that you could go down the Acquisitions Incorporated path. And it went from being a very serious game, and when you went down the AI path, it had a
Yeah.
very comedic type of feel. Versus, you can watch Critical Role and some of these other games on Twitch or YouTube or whatever. If you're Patreon, you get more. You can see how there's humor, but there's also a serious gaming component to it. You can watch people like Stephen Colbert play online. There's a lot of people. Jace, you posted an article recently, I think, about how the Star Trek Discovery cast, number of the cast play now.
I think I might be wrong. Maybe don't quote me on this, but I think Anthony Rapp DMs
Yep.
for a bunch of them.
Yeah.
Right.
And they really got into it during the pandemic
Oh yeah.
when they were and also when they were filming, because they were all in effect quarantined together in a
Right.
bubble
Right.
to film. So they got into this whole gaming thing. So I think it's not like Pathfinder Second Edition came out of nowhere. They've been obviously working on this a while, but I think they saw the writing on the wall and realized we have this consumer base that we have almost used up for 3.5. We have to bring in other people,
Right.
and it has
Right.
caused. If you read online, it there's a little bit of a D&D 4-esque type of feel to people's responses to 2e.
Okay, so let's talk about what we think are some of the more salient, maybe the one or two more salient uh differences. Um Okay, so I'm gonna say this, and Brad's gonna correct me because I've never played 2E. I think I don't know, as I was prepping in my mind for this episode, Brad, for the first time ever, I started thinking, maybe we ought to play at some point, like try 2E. At like I'm getting curious, and then that would be countered by don't buy another book.
Well, the problem I had, and you know this because we talked, because we've moved to this weekly schedule. Jason and I talk about our schedule path, like he discussed at the beginning of the episode.
Mm,
I pushed back a little on the idea of recording Pathfinder right now because we
mm,
haven't played 2E.
mm.
I've read some of the 2E material I've read online. I go to Reddit. I like hearing people's opinions on it, but I didn't feel like I had enough exposure yet. I spent a lot of time this week doing it. Jason, you spent a lot of time even prior to this week doing it. I feel like we can have this conversation at the level we're having with enough knowledge.
Yeah,
But
as
but
posers.
yes, but I do think I have to agree with you, and then I'm going to pause because I interrupted you.
Mm-mm.
I do think as I pick up, remember the rule we're not supposed to page through books while we're online.
Just do it. You
Yeah,
want
so
to.
you can hear the pages.
Oh, that
I
is a good
have the
sound.
second edition tome, which feels even thicker than the first edition.
Brad's holding it up intentionally on screen right now so that
Yes,
and
and
caressing it
yeah,
disturbingly so that I'm motivated to buy one. I'm waiting for it to come out.
Amazon calls you,
Yeah.
Jace. Amazon calls.
Right. So the thing that intrigues me, and I had to, like you said, Brad, we've both been doing research on this. The thing that intrigues me about 2E more than anything, because I know they're coming out with new adventure paths, clearly. And they've also been clear from the beginning, since I think since 2E was in beta testing, that they were also going to release some of their most popular 1E adventure paths for 2E. And obviously one can convert, although that's got to be a big deal. It's busy enough prepping to GM a game, much less a campaign. But what stands out to me, as I've said to you, is the action economy. Okay, so in Pathfinder 1E, you have a standard action plus a move action, right? Or sometimes you can have a full round action as an alternative. But essentially, 1E uses the tried and true, almost universal action economy, agnostic across world, platform mechanic of you get to do something and you get to move a bit. So you've got your standard action and a move action. Okay, that was an easy one to wrap my mind around. 2E has single action, 2 action activity, 3 action activity, a reaction, and a free action. And like I had listened to
Let me just
yeah,
mention
yeah.
because you bring this up. I like I said, I have the book. I'm looking at the classes pages, so I'm looking at Rangers, and I'm looking at the different feats, for example. And I'm looking at, so Rangers have a 2 action activity called penetrating shot, or a reaction called twin repost. I mean, it's I find this fascinating, and I can't swear on this, but I
It's
want to
it's
I want to
like
say you sucker, because now you got me looking at this book like I want to play. But keep going.
Mwah. What I don't know what it says about me, but lately I keep hearing the Emperor in my head from Star Wars. And right now, when you say that, yeah, right now when you say that, all I can hear is good, good. And that's what's happening to you. So it's interesting because like when you read those examples, that's still pretty crunchy, but the amount of freedom that the action economy gives you, the amount of choice, let me put it that way, the amount of choice that you get in 2E does sound way, 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 way more than 1E. Just so that everyone knows who's listening, since we don't, and we're never going to record a video of these, Brad on Zoom is posting in the chat, buy me, buy me, buy me, which is funny because I mean, Brad walks past something that 3 years ago he thought he might like, and he buys the whole set. but yeah, it's okay.
We've talked.
Angie's not
about
there.
it.
You're fine. Your wife's not there.
There's no chance. Angie, if you've actually listened this far, one, you already know that, and two, wow. So, but yeah, keep going back what you're saying, but it's still crunchy. But there's the term economy plays into it. We just got done talking about economics, so it's funny you bring this up now because now there's an economy of action.
Okay, so with your permission, I want to say, and it's your fault because you're talking about economies. You're right. I did bring up action economy, but that's that's what it's called. But let's face it, everybody, that when you look at the mechanics of any game, ultimately you're talking about, because we're ignoring story right now, when you look at the mechanics, you're talking about skill checks, whether you want to call them, or let's just call them checks. Some are combat, some are not, but you're talking about checks. And when you're talking about checks, when you're talking about skills, let's be honest, most of the time we want to know right away, what does the check system, what does the mechanic look like in combat? Thank you for the Amazon link. I'll look into that later. If it makes you feel better, Brad, while you were talking before, I was looking up the price of Rise of the Rune Lords, and let me tell you, I won't be buying that anytime soon.
No.
That's become pure gold.
Okay,
yeah, okay.
But look at that other link. Continue.
Okay, I will look at it. I promise I will look at it. Thank you for the distraction. So let's talk about action economy for a sec, because we've been going for a while in this episode, and I think honestly, in brief, we've addressed the things about Pathfinder we wanted to talk about, really just giving kind of our surface overview of this is a little bit about the game. This is how we see it. I want to reiterate that I think we are both impressed by the sheer richness of the world or worlds or planes in Pathfinder. It doesn't take a backseat to anybody as a game. But action economy, let's just review for a moment. We've looked at games like Star Wars from FFG. We've looked at D&D. We've now looked at Pathfinder. We've looked at a number of them. Next week, we're going to look at Fate. And we did this on purpose, didn't we? That we have Pathfinder followed by Fate for two reasons. First reason is you could not have a more orthogonal pairing than Pathfinder's uber crunchiness with the D20 system and Fate's Fate dice, or what they used to be called initially fudge dice, right? Which literally just have two symbols and blanks. And so I guess the point I'm trying to make here is there are any number of action economies, some of which, as you were saying, are more economical than others, some of which are efficient, some of which are not. They're a bear. Like if you look at the Warhammer system, and we've mentioned that in passing once or twice, maybe we'll get there, we'll see, but it has a totally different economy, totally different mechanic. I mean, it's unlike anything we've discussed on this podcast. There are all kinds of ways to skin this proverbial cat when it comes to action economies and when it comes to mechanics in general. And I guess I said this, so I'll finish this. The other reason we're going to move into Fate next week is because then it's the perfect handoff, the way we see it, to talking about world building. So I just want to talk about that for a sec, not world building specifically, but again, coming back to real life, we've now talked on and off about enough games where I think, Brad, we can start to come full circle. It's kind of a hint of what's to come in another couple episodes. One of the reasons we started a discussion around this podcast was not merely for the amazing amount of fame and glory and income we're making off of this podcast, which, just so everyone's clear, is 0, 0, and 0, but because every mechanic is another way of looking at real life. It's another way of quantifying what actually exists. And Pathfinder offers us, maybe offers people like you and me, Brad, who tend to get a little too molecular, a little too quickly in our analyses. Let's be honest. It offers us something that is a little bit alluring if we're not careful. It's a bit of a slippery slope.
Yeah, and just a sidebar in 1 sec. I think anytime now we all had gotten together. It wasn't last weekend. It was the weekend before, right?
It was. We
2
were
weekends
together.
ago.
We were
2
together for
weekends
our
ago.
family event 2 weekends ago, and then we were together, the guys, the weekend before that.
Yeah. So whenever we get together, and Jason, your father, actually said this when we were all together as a group, that it is fascinating how we all gel so quickly, so fast. And any conversation we have, there aren't many conversations that we have that stay at a standard level. I don't want to even say basic level because it sounds like I'm making a judgment against everyone.
We don't do overviews.
Yeah, we are a player's handbook with every conversation we have when it comes to Path. We're just in general. I shouldn't say with Path.
No, that's perfect. Yeah, that's perfect.
I think that's what attracted me to originally to it. Now I bit off more than I could chew, but this book with world building, and I'm even looking at online. They actually have like the Lost Omens World Guide. Some people like it, some people don't. But they're giving you material. It's almost like they're giving you material in a different way this time around in the second edition. That even feels to me, versus first edition as a consumer, more like they want this creativity. They want even more creativity this go around. They're trying to give you the tools to build your own. They still have the adventure paths. If you go out, example, to Amazon, you can see all these different adventure paths. And there are some folks, I think that's a second edition, Tyrant's Grasp. There's a couple of, and then Age of Ashes. There's a number of adventure paths that are already out for second edition.
But I think you're right. I think if you look at Eric Mona, if you look at Jason Bullman, like what they write, what they say when they're talking to people, there's a real receptivity to creativity, to story building, my friend, I think you nailed it on the head that our discussions in our group, and especially like ours, they're players, they're like rule book, player's handbook kind of discussions. And I think they're trying to roll that out to people.
Yeah, and I think, some people can tolerate being in a discussion with us. Some people can bore of it quickly. That I think probably will go into the fact that you might be on the first episode and might not have just made it past, or you're with us on this episode. Because you're hearing an organic and obviously maybe somewhat abridged version of every conversation we have. I think that's what attracted me to Pathfinder, because it seemed, I still think it seems, I think originally it seemed, but it was a lot, to us to feel like more of an us game. Turned out D&D did too, because we made it deep, but I still go back to it, especially, with us joking about playing second edition. I still feel like it's our game. We just haven't had the time to tackle it yet because we've been doing other things, and I tried it first and we just weren't ready. We were just getting back into role playing.
I will say I did make the mistake of clicking on the link as you were talking, and I didn't realize that there was a pocket edition that would neatly match. Yeah.
I purposefully sent you the pocket edition version link to
I know.
second edition.
Yeah, I know.
So
You're a
you'll
bad,
get it
bad
there.
man.
You'll get it on Monday.
No, no, I'm not. I'm
If you click on it right now, it'll arrive on the 23rd, which is 2 days from now.
as Iomade is my witness. I am not going to order this book tonight. Doing magic hands on the screen is also not going to motivate
These are
me.
magic fingers, and you're
Yeah.
going to buy the book tonight. Okay, sorry, folks.
Okay.
This is the humor you get from us when we talk about books.
Okay,
and gaming
so
and
since
such.
we're degenerating, or at least degrading, let's walk over to the GM's corner. And your answer might better not be, oh, the second edition
No,
pocket guide.
we'll leave
Yeah.
you cannot say second edition player's handbook for Pathfinder as part of the GM's.
GM's, okay, good.
That's
Glad
our
to
rule.
thank you. That's our rule
Okay.
for tonight.
That's our rule.
What have you been doing? What's been occupying your headspace?
I have been reading a book that has a 2, or it has the letters SECOND on it, and E. No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I did do a lot of prep this past week by reading more first edition. I did, like I told you, I did my research on second edition prior. I needed to go back and look at first edition. The other game, I will look at Fate this week, but I keep coming back to it for a multitude of reasons. Next to me, in front of me right now, is second edition. To my right here is D&D 5. This is my work desk as well, so I need to find a place to work. And then below the player's handbook and DM guide for 5e is Genesis. So that has been, if we're talking about gaming, that has been my focus this week. Jason and I were just talking because I have a collection of somewhat archaic, much like you with the discount bin. That's how I ended up getting the True 20 material. I have been taking pictures of the books because I'm going to start doing some Instagram posting and see what other people think of some, not so much like the monster manuals or whatever the case is, but the tomes that added classes or added things to the worlds. I want to see if I can generate some discussion with some of these books to see how people felt they were valuable in that world, or even other games like the Firefly role-playing game that failed out, or True 20 like I mentioned, or One Ring. One Ring is another one that intrigues me because as I'm reading, or if I remember correctly, the One Ring, Jason, you and I haven't talked about it. It was a Middle-earth-esque game. People have been trying to build a Middle-earth RPG forever. You had the Adventures in Middle-earth that used the 5e engine. In effect, they were 5e source books to play Middle-earth within the D&D 5 rule set. You had the One Ring, which had its own dice dynamic to it. That it just kind of fell apart. But if I remember correctly, I think there's a Kickstarter or something where they're going to try to restart it again. So I sit here and I've laid my Middle-earth ones on top of some other books on my shelf. Middle-earth still is interesting to me. I don't think I have a lot of interest in playing it. I think the books are interesting. I'm one of the few people that did not read Tolkien until he was an adult. I remember reading The Hobbit as a kid, but I never read it. Yeah,
Same here.
I never read it. And for those, they will find this to be sacrilege. I didn't read the books until I saw the movies. So
I insisted on I'd read The Hobbit as a kid, obviously, and then I've read that subsequently. But I read each of the movies when they came out. That was my motivation, Brad, to read each of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, so that I would make sure to read it before I'd see the movie.
We both have a friend, Russ, who for some reason or another I had associated with Tolkien, and I remember years ago.
Because he's read it. He loves it. He knows the world.
Yeah.
He knows the world and the ages better than anyone else I know.
He is a, I would say, bona fide expert on Middle Earth.
Yeah.
And I went to the theater with him when the Two Towers came out. I knew nothing other than The Hobbit, and I went right into the second movie. So it was a very odd situation. I'm like, I have no idea what I just watched. It was 3 hours. So I told him as we were coming out of the theater, this is, I don't know when Two Towers came out, 2002 or something. I told him when I came out, I'm like, before we go to another movie like this, I need to read it. And he said to me, the only way you should read it is if it's in a single volume with everything. The Lord of the Rings as a single volume rather than it broken down into the Fellowship of the Ring, the Two Towers, and the Return of the King.
Interesting.
So I bought a paperback version that I still have on my shelf of the Lord of the Rings single tome.
Barnes and Noble with the cover that came out when the movies were coming out because it was so inexpensive. Thick single volume is what I have.
Yep. I think I probably have the very same one.
Probably.
And so digress. The One Ring is coming out. I have no interest in playing Middle Earth. It's a good read, and for me, I believe it's a good set of movies. Phenomenal set. It's a phenomenal film series. I like the material to read. I don't want to play it, but The One Ring is fascinating to me. How about you?
So mine is, I've been immersed in sci-fi, not fantasy. Put the second edition handbook down. So, or I guess you could argue it's sci-fantasy, though I don't like that. Ever since on a previous episode, you told me you want to play Star Wars to get some more experience with the Genesis dice system.
Yes.
I've been thinking about that, and you and I have been talking about that, a little bit of a back channel. And I know I've sent you a couple hints, like visuals where you can't really make anything out. What have I been doing? So with semester starting up and everything going on positively in my life, it's been busy, but I've taken with my girls away up north at camp for the week. I've had these afternoons, evenings where, Amy and I, it's just quiet. So over a couple days this week, I sat down, Brad, and I planned the adventure for episode 1 with both success and failure options. Wahaha. And so I did that. Meanwhile, thinking, because I'd already the week before I'd taken a page of notes on kind of the story, the world building. And so you and I still need to have a session 0, or at least you make your character and then you tell me what they are. But I can tell you, I prepped the adventure and I've done it so that it runs about an hour because I know that works for us. And if it ends up being a one-off or just a few, it'll work well. If you wanted more over an extended period of time, this could readily turn into a campaign. And so now, over the next week or so, I probably will commit pen to paper because I want to write the intro to it to kind of get you in the imagery and the mindset. And I need to work on the NPCs, and I need to finish fleshing out the world building, the whole backstory that takes place. But I will give you, what can I give you as a,
I'll say just in all seriousness,
Yeah.
and joking about the second edition Pathfinder, my interest more is playing that Star Wars because you've teased enough, and we do need to have a session 0 because the point is there are 2 reasons. One, because it'll help us with Genesis.
Yep.
In my mind, it'll help me with Genesis.
Yeah, me too.
2, I just want to play. I want to play that as much as I want to continue our D&D 5 adventure. I think playing jokes aside, second edition would be fun, but and I think we should some point sooner rather than later. But more than anything, right now, Star Wars. And I didn't bring it up during GM because I wanted to leave that to you. But just so you know, me doing little subtle in front of the camera, dancing second edition player's guides aside, I would do the same thing with Force and Destiny or Edge of the Empire, or whatever. I want to play.
So you already know that the name of the campaign, even if it's only a few adventures, a few episodes, the name of the campaign is Droids and Destiny. No, sorry, Destiny and Droids. I have a name for the first episode. I'll share that with you when that adventure is done. I'll give you just this hint, and then we can call it an episode. This one, not Star Wars. Our campaign, our adventures are going to take place approximately in a 25,000 light year stretch of space abutting the western edge of Hut space, about approximately 36 ABY. So after the events, a handful of years after the events, about 5 after the events of Rise of Skywalker, influenced strongly by Hut space, and you'll have a ship. And that's all I'm going to say.
And just so people may already know this or not, you got into playing FFG Star Wars before Age of Rebellion, before Force and Destiny were out. You started playing with Edge of the Empire rulebook. You played that Edge of the Empire set. So the idea that we're playing on the edge of Hut space is intriguing to me, because I know you've played the outside. You liked playing outside of the Rebellion and the Empire and the Jedi, and the Edge.
Yep. You know? Except that keep in mind that the western border, the western edge of Hut space, is not Outer Rim. It's expansion regions. So it's a heavily trafficked area. Kind of per your request, our little set of adventures is going to be an amalgam of Edge of the Empire and Force and Destiny mindsets and play styles. And so there's going to be some swashbuckling, or at least ponderous walking, and there's going to be probably quite a bit of trade and craft, and then there will also be the Force, and there will also be things like that. So with that, as Brad gives me the signal here, it's probably time to wrap it up. As always, we thank all of you for joining us, hopefully every week. If you like what you're hearing, please tell us. If you don't like what you're hearing, just keep it to yourself. We're good with that. Check us out on Facebook. Check us out on our soon-to-be reinvigorated Instagram, probably by the time you hear this episode that it drops. Let us know if there are real-life topics, work, family, children. We're not going to touch spouses because no one wins with that discussion. Anything in real life, recreation, we would love to have more topics so that it's not just us talking about that intersection of RPGs and real life. In the interim, be well, stay well. We will talk to you all next week. Bye-bye.